Welcome back to another segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. Today I'm going to talk about an episode from Season 4, The Prophecy, where John attends his 25-year class reunion. Early in the episode, it becomes evident that John is having a bad week. He's in the sawmill, things aren't going the way he wants, his hand's bothering him. He's just experiencing some signs of getting a bit older. Unfortunately, too many of us know that routine. Grandpa is saying, oh, you got a touch of the rheumatism, and John's saying, I don't have rheumatism, and Olivia's sort of smiling about the routine, thinking that John is perhaps being overly sensitive to this whole thing and worrying a little needlessly about it. Into this situation of John's comes Lemay, who he went to school with, and she is now heading up the reunion party, gathering together the classmates that can make it to their 25th reunion. And she is basically assigning people chores. She says she can't do it all herself, and so she is just volunteering people like John and Zach, who they went to school with, and Grady, who they went to school with, and Grover Cleveland, who they went to school with. And the character of Lemay is played by Lynn Carlin, who we saw in later episodes come back as the love interest of Ep Bridges and the woman he ultimately married. She was playing a different character at that point. So this is another example of a guest star who played more than one character during the seasons of the Waltons. As there is a conversation going on around the dinner table, I liked how the director used Mary Ellen pouring coffee as a means to move the conversation, move the camera's focus around the table to pick up who was speaking at a given time. So rather than having to do a separate cut in what we would call the master, the camera follows Mary Ellen. Zach Roswell, played by actor James Gammon, comes by to talk with John about the class reunion. Now, the character of Zach was one that we saw in a number of episodes, but this was the first time I remember hearing that John and Zach were in the same grade. They graduated together. So we heard John talk about Yancey being one of his oldest friends, but it doesn't say anything about Yancey being part of the same graduating class. I think he also went to school with Ike, but doesn't in this case say that Ike was in the same graduating class. So Zach and John share the sense that they don't fit in at the reunion, that many of their classmates have gone on to more, say, prominent or important positions, made more money in a sense, so theoretically have been a bigger success, and that John and Zach are both feeling a little uncomfortable about attending this reunion that they probably feel is going to just show up their shortcomings and make them perhaps feel not so good about themselves by comparison with their classmates. But they figure they'll help get each other through it. Grover Cleveland Cathcart, played by James Ray, is another one of their classmates who comes into town for the reunion. He is now, I believe, a politician in DC, and he married one of their other classmates who isn't attending. She's not well or something. His wife was someone that Olivia remembers, and maybe there was a touch of jealousy there about a couple of the women that were classmates of John's and that she feels were perhaps women he looked at and was interested in and were sort of her competition back then. Having been recruited by Lemay to take on certain aspects of organizing the class reunion, John, with Olivia, goes to visit Martin Renshaw, who he's over in another town. I can't remember if it's Rockfish or something like that. But this is actor William Phipps, who I guess there is family money, and his house is where they plan to host the reunion dinner. And he is very uncomfortable because Lemay says, well, it's your house and you have to say the blessing, and Martin is painfully shy, and so he's very uncomfortable about that. And John promises that if it comes down to it, he will do that for Martin and help Martin also get through this reunion. heading back to report into Lemay, John knocks on May's door and is greeted by Rachel Stubblefield, played by actress Sandra Deal, and she sees him and immediately kisses him. John's a little taken aback and then figures out who it is, and again, another classmate, and one that we find out briefly in their senior year that John and Rachel were actually engaged for a brief period of time. So this is also news to us. But they talk about their classmates and things that have happened. I think she's been married 4 times. So just a very different path that her life took. B.C. Grady comes by. This is actor Noble Willingham. He has his whole family with him, including his wife, Viola, who is played by actress Deanna Lund. Some of you may remember Deanna from the series Land of the Giants back in the day. He has about 3 children that are all running around being pretty crazy, including the youngest, who is chasing the chickens around in the coop. This is once again Cammie's brother, Jeff Kotler. I didn't realize how many episodes Jeffrey not only was in, but actually was a character that in some cases had lines, but was definitely featured. We saw him frequently in the schoolhouse, and so I guess they figured people wouldn't necessarily identify him as one single character. But the children are all out of control, and BC is trying to talk with John about the reunion and what's going on in his life, and he's trying to get Viola to control the children. So again, we just see a very different sort of family, and the way in which another classmate of John's, his life is how it's different from what John's is. There's a whole subplot in this episode that features John Boy, and early in the episode, John Boy is crossing the campus and he comes across Dr. Porter. John Boy introduces himself, and Dr. Porter asks John Boy what his plan is, what he plans to do, how he plans to make a living. John Boy says, well, I'm a writer. And he's like, yeah, but how are you going to make a living? And he basically says that most writers, the majority of writers, don't make a living at it. Even the ones whose names that they actually make their living doing something else. This is very disconcerting to John Boy. So John Boy spends this episode trying to figure out how to reconcile this for himself. And at one point, Jim Bob comes home, and John Boy has been using a stick to write in the dirt, and he's written 10,000. Jim Bob says, 10,000 what? And he goes, well, that's how many out of work writers there are and in the US. And Jim Bob says, well, that's stupid. John Boy is like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, you're a writer. You make up ideas and you put them on paper, right? And he's like, yeah. He says, well, so you work for yourself, right? He's like, uh-huh. He said, so if you work for yourself, how can you be out of work? Which is an interesting way to say it. So yes, John Boy can work anytime, but can he get paid for what he's doing? And that, again, is often the challenge for people in the arts, is how do you actually make money doing what you love and what you're passionate about, and in many cases, what you are best at. So John Boy continues to try and sort out this dilemma. A little later, Mary Ellen knocks at the door. John Boy doesn't answer. She finally sort of enters, and he's just sitting there, and she's like, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm trying to think of writers who actually make money as writers." And she mentions Margaret Mitchell, who wrote Gone with the Wind. He's like, yeah, of course, besides her. And so they start getting into a back and forth about writers and ones that make a living. And Mary Ellen names a few people, but John Boy sort of blows them off because they aren't what he considers serious writers. Maybe they write murder mysteries or something that John Boy doesn't consider higher writing, the John Steinbecks and the Hemingways of the world. And he begins to maybe change a bit of his perspective on it, but it was a really fun scene to have where, so much of the time the interaction between John Boy and Mary Ellen was contentious or them picking on each other in a fun, teasing sort of way as siblings. But in this case, they're really sort of on the same side, where Mary Ellen is actually trying to help John Boy resolve something. So I liked that. Ultimately, the Waltons end up hosting the class graduation dinner because Martin Renshaw's mother broke her hip and is camped out in their living room, so they can't hold the dinner at their house. So Grandma and Olivia say, we'll do it here. It's short notice, but we'll make it work. And so everyone gathers in the Walton front yard. Jason and some of his musician friends play music. We have put together all kinds of food and put a series of tables out in the front yard. There's a cute thing where Grandpa is getting them to make ice cream. So he's kind of corralled them and is keeping them going over there. And you see Jeff Kotler and the two other children, and Elizabeth's there. And so they're sort of wrangled there as people mingle about and have, lemonade punch and have something to eat. Seeking a bit of refuge from the party, John goes up and finds John Boy in his room. And John Boy is reading a letter he got from Dr. Porter, where Dr. Porter sort of takes back a bit of what he said to John Boy and how negative he was about trying to pursue writing as a career. And Dr. Porter shared a quote from Sinclair Lewis. And as John Boy reads it to John and is really looking at John Boy from a new perspective, he begins to see that John's sense of lack of accomplishment for the 25 years since he graduated is not what he was thinking, and that as he sees John Boy as, in a sense, one of his accomplishments, that he has raised this bright, intelligent, passionate young man who is going to go forward and create a wonderful life for himself. And I think probably through extension, John also realizes that all of his children are a major accomplishment in his life, and he begins to look differently about what his life has been. The classmates sit around the table and start reminiscing about the yearbook and who was voted most likely to this, that, or the other thing, and they come down to who was most likely to succeed. And it was John Walton. This house and this business and his family, and John did exactly what the prophecy said, that he was most likely to succeed, that he has succeeded in living the life he wanted to live, and that he has created a wonderful life for himself. And maybe it isn't from the outside the most successful, he doesn't make the most money, it's not showy, he doesn't have fame or fortune, but it is a wonderful life, and it's a life that John can be proud of and that others from the outside can envy. And I think it's a wonderful message to us all about what we seek and what we go after and what's really important in life, and that it isn't always the outside accolades, but the small things and the most important things in our lives. This was one of the few occasions where the Goodnights were not just featured on the house at night with the lights in the upper windows, but you actually see John sitting at this table where his classmates were, and as the Goodnights are said from the windows, that John reflects on his life, and we see another side of John, the depth of him and his reflections on his life. And to me, there was something about how poignant that moment was, seeing John sitting at that table outside as the Goodnights proceed, that I kept seeing Ralph, not John Walton, but Ralph, and a deeper side of Ralph that you didn't always see as John Walton when he was lighthearted and teasing and, or he was angry about something. This is sort of the inner, deepest part of the man and what he brought to John in such a poignant way, and things that I reflected on and saw in Ralph in real life. So it meant a lot to me to rewatch this moment from the series. That's what I have for you for this segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons about the episode from season 4, The Prophecy. I will be back with more Behind the Scenes of the Waltons, more of your questions in an Ask Judy, and who knows what here in 2023 as we continue. Thanks for watching.